far? How fast? And how much? These are the three big questions that, for as long as I've been covering this sector, people who are new to electric vehicles want to know the answer to. Of course, there are plenty more questions that also get asked, such as, what happens when all the batteries die? How long does it take to charge up? And how much does it cost to fill up? But when all is said and done, range and associated questions tend to get top billing. Just like gas mileage for an internal combustion engine vehicle, the real-world range of an EV is one of its biggest selling points for new car buyers. They want to know how far they can travel before they need to stop. They want to make sure that this new car they're considering is capable of the trips they want to take in it. But most likely, in reality, they very rarely will. And sometimes, because there's more metaphorical dick-waving in everyone's Neanderthal brain than some of us would care to admit, they want to know that they're buying the biggest, best, baddest vehicle they can. So when an automaker is accused, directly or indirectly, of exaggerating their vehicle's real-world range, and that story gets picked up by national and international media, it feels like it's time for another one of our FUD-busting videos. Make sure you're fully charged. Oh, and that metaphorical dick-waving thing? It's not just a male-identified thing, you know. For those who have been under a rock for the past few weeks, or, perhaps on holiday, which is honestly a more likely explanation, you may have missed reporting from Reuters and other news outlets claiming that Tesla exploits the rulebook when it comes to EPA range tests. That report, using data from SAE International, claims on average Tesla's entire range of electric vehicles consistently fall short of their advertised range by as much as 26%. Moreover, citing sources at the company, the reporting went further, alleging that Tesla has a special team of service professionals whose sole job is to appease customers who complain to Tesla about the real-world range of their cars. That team directs those people away from an in-person service appointment and tries to fob them off. That has, predictably, led to a lot of anger online from Tesla owners, Tesla stockholders, and those who feel that the media is not being fair to Tesla. Arguing against the reporting, some rightly point out that other automakers also often fall short of their predicted ranges. They argue that no vehicle gets its rated range in the real world, and they point out that in the case of this story, the problem lies not with Tesla, but with the EPA, the organisation who sets fuel economy testing cycles for new vehicles in North America. But, as is usually the case, the reality is much more nuanced than a few sound bites can handle, so today I'm going to try and add some much needed context to this story. First, let's get the obvious one out of the way. Your mileage will, and does, vary. We live in an infinitely complicated world, and while the laws of physics remain the same for all of us, unless you're a superhero, magical being, or happen to be in possession of an infinity stone, the way in which those things obeying those laws interact with one another are very, very difficult to model. And although we can make some educated guesses about how systems will interact and even make mathematical models that accurately predict the aerodynamic drag of a particular shape moving at a particular speed on a perfectly flat road with a well-known rolling resistance, the world is not predictable. And this is true for all types of vehicles, be they human-powered, electrically powered, or powered by the screams of small children. Weather conditions, the condition of the vehicle's tyres and the air pressure the load of the vehicle is carrying, and the temperature of the car's battery pack and motors all impact range. And that can make the process of predicting how far you'll be able to travel particularly difficult and complex. It's the same for gas mileage in an internal combustion engine vehicle, and is frankly the reason why automakers tend to use fuzzy maths when your battery pack is nearly empty or the fuel tank is almost dry. When you're that low on energy, a large hill or a spot of rain can be the difference between making it to your destination or being stranded, regardless of fuel type. In an attempt to homogenise testing and try to give automakers a reasonably fair crack at the whip and to give customers a far more realistic set of expectations, testing bodies around the world, there are several, all devise tests designed to mimic real-world driving scenarios, which on paper is great. The problem, though, as I've already said, is that it's hard to mimic the real world in the virtual world, however many simulations Elon Musk may have pondered we live in, and regardless of if you have an improbability drive or not, there's not one particular mathematical model that fits every scenario. So just as society tends to portray a nuclear family as a mum, dad, 2.4 kids and a Labrador named Boomer living in a pretty suburban house in a temperate climate, a stereotype that honestly was out of date when Zork first launched, the EPA and other bodies around the world have their little cosy stereotypical routes designed to portray the average daily driving duties of the average car. To keep things fair, these tests are carried out on a dynamometer, a rolling road, inside a laboratory. The tests themselves are extremely prescriptive and are designed to mimic city driving scenarios, a highway driving scenario, and some other test scenarios thrown in for good measure. Importantly, while EV range tests are derived from the tests designed for fossil fuel vehicles, final efficiency is calculated ever so slightly differently. And I'm going to detail some of the basics next, although I am not going to go into great detail. So if you want more info, just follow the link in the down below to the EPA.gov website, where more thorough details are available on the various EV test cycles that cars have to go through. Simply put, the city test cycle, which is carried out with no air conditioning, no heating, and no ventilation, is designed to mimic city speed driving, complete with lots of stop-and-go traffic. The highway test, meanwhile, simulates higher speed travel, is longer in duration, and has fewer stop-starts, but again is without any heating, air conditioning, or ventilation, and tends to mimic suburban driving rather than rural driving. In the case of EVs, the city test is repeated from a full battery pack until said battery pack is empty. Similarly, for EVs, the highway test is looped repeatedly from a full charge to an empty one. And once those tests have been completed, the results are multiplied by a factor, usually 0.7 or thereabouts, to account for things like a more aggressive driving style, actually using the heating and the air conditioning. Unless I'm wrong though, and I'm often wrong, I don't believe that testing takes into account the energy consumption by such systems, which in an internal combustion engine may be less of a problem since heating is a byproduct of an inefficient engine and AC is just a small supplemental load on the engine while it's actually running. Anyway, the important takeaway from all of this is that it's a laboratory test using a test cycle that is frankly not very representative of how most of us drive on a day-to-day basis. And what's also missed, and that the EPA really underscores on its website, is that while the EPA determines official test procedures that automakers must follow, the EPA itself does not test every new car that comes to market. Instead, automakers are essentially on the honour system. They are responsible for testing their own vehicles, carefully or not, following the guidelines laid out by the EPA. Once the tests have been completed and the range is calculated according to that official formulae, those ratings are submitted to the relevant standards body, which then looks at them and goes, yeah, looks about right. That basically comes in the form of data auditing, in which the EPA or the other standard body does some rough calculations to make sure that the submitted data makes some sense and occasionally backs that up with in-house testing to verify any wayward submitted figures. And this is all super important because most people believe that the EPA, or whatever your regional local standards agency is, does all of their own testing in-house. Most people think that the fault lies with the test agency for not devising a test properly or testing things properly. But it's more complex than that because, just like any standard, there's quite a bit of wiggle room. Some automakers, Porsche, Mercedes-Benz and BMW come to mind, actively submit test results for range ratings that are pretty pessimistic, opting to use a different multiplier than the standard 0.7 to mimic real-world range. The figures submitted are purposely calculated to not necessarily be worst-case scenarios, but definitely suboptimal. What's more, there's no penalty from any standards agency for automakers that opt to do that. A fantastic demonstration of this is the EQE 500 4MATIC from Mercedes-Benz we literally just wrapped a week of filming with. Its official EPA-rated range is about 253 miles or 407 kilometres per charge. But at no point in the last 7 days has anyone on the team seen less than 300 miles, 482 kilometres of range per charge on a full battery. And on one day, Kate saw a good 100 miles, 160 kilometres more than the EPA quoted range. Other automakers, they sadly do the opposite. Ford, Chevrolet, Volkswagen, and a few others join Tesla on the list. They seem to engineer their range tests to be as super optimistic as possible, and Tesla, as we've seen documented time and time again, fits in with that group lovely. It's not alone. There are plenty of other automakers who, while their quoted range is overly optimistic, may be less optimistic than Tesla tends to be. Over the years, we have seen many people try to explain why Tesla tends to be the most optimistic about its vehicle range of any EV company. Some people just come straight out and claim that Tesla is trying to pull a fast one. Others argue that, unlike most automakers who tend to be based in places that get kind of cold in the winter, Tesla was first based in California with the Californian climate in mind, and later in Texas, where it doesn't traditionally get all that cold in the winter. And frankly, I don't know what the answer is, and I don't honestly think it's important here. What I do think is important, though, is that there appears to be fairly consistent over-exaggeration of real-world range, and that in turn can lead people to make bad purchase decisions. If we go back to those first three questions, how far, how fast, and how much, people look at the range per charge in the same way that they look at gas mileage. Higher mileage is better. More is better. Bigger is better. And look, the history books are littered with automakers who overestimated their official gas mileage figures for internal combustion engine vehicles. Honda is someone who comes to mind as an automaker which got into a lot of trouble for overestimating its real-world range for some of its Civic models in certain adverts. And for a buyer who doesn't understand how these range ratings are achieved, or perhaps just takes the figures at face value, they are going to pick a vehicle that has a large number over one that has a smaller number, even if the larger rated vehicle has an impossibly optimistic figure and the other has a terribly pessimistic one. But the more crowded a market becomes, and the more automakers opt to use realistic range quotes rather than optimistic ones, things start to improve. Additionally, these overestimations might not be a problem for everyone, especially if you drive closer to whatever the average annual mileage is for your particular geographic region, and you rarely do a long-distance trip, which statistically most people don't. And they're less likely to be a problem for experienced EV drivers who understand how to eke out their very best range from their vehicles. But more on that in a moment. Inaccurate range figures are also less of a problem in areas with really good EV charging infrastructure, where there's a charging station every 30 miles or 50 kilometres that you can stop at in an emergency and recharge. And they're less of a problem in places with fewer mountain passes or extremes of temperature. And, wait for it, inaccurate or over-optimistic range ratings are less of a problem when you own a car that dynamically adjusts its route while you are driving it to take into account any changes in real-world efficiency, which is exactly what Tesla does in its cars. Tesla doesn't highlight that you're not getting the EPA test figure. It shows you, on a graph inside the car, that your efficiency is different to perhaps what the car thought it would be at the start of the trip, and then quietly, confidently, predictably directs you to a different place to recharge as required. For a long while, Tesla was the only automaker to successfully implement this, but as EV technology improves, we are starting to see more automakers opt to follow Tesla's lead. If I am long distancing in my F-150 Lightning with a cab full of people and a bed full of camera equipment, my truck will actively change our route to compensate for lower efficiency due to a higher load. That's very different to the days of old, when you'd be driving white-knuckled with the AC off, praying to any god who would listen that you'd make it to your next charging stop in one piece, and please don't make me stop at the side of the road. Whenever the thorny subject of range ratings comes up, we will invariably have people commenting about how they were able to reach the EPA rating, or how someone like Bjorn Nyland beat the EPA range during an epic long-distance test. And yet, like I've already pointed out, if you have the skills and the patience, it is possible to get most EVs to beat their EPA range by a significant amount. But that is not how most people drive, and frankly, EPA range shouldn't be something that you need to hypermile in order to achieve. It needs to be a realistic yard arm that everyone can reach, no matter what. One way around all of this, of course, is to redefine how the EPA range rating system works, and work harder to penalise automakers who might be adhering to the particulars of the test cycle but not following the spirit of the test, which is of course designed to give customers a good expectation of what's possible with a given vehicle. For what it's worth, I think we should be pushing for all test cycles to be much more pessimistic than they currently are, taking into account increased traffic patterns and the worst possible driving conditions. At the end of the day, I think that consumers are going to be a lot happier owning a car that exceeds range ratings more often than one that only meets them in a very narrow, perfect day scenario. One way, of course, would be to change the multiplier that the EPA and other agencies use, and the other would be to change the state of charge range that is used for a test. Personally, I would love to see range ratings given for vehicles between 80 and 20% full, as that's realistically the range that you tend to use on a long-distance trip between fast charging stations. And if you're not road tripping, it's probably not something you think twice about anyway. I also think that official range ratings should demonstrate the lowest, most pessimistic range, as well as a more optimistic range rating, instead of one figure for each type of driving scenario. Let's have a range. We should also be calling out Tesla and other automakers who are repeat offenders when it comes to overestimating real-world range. Tesla is by far the most blatant offender here, but as I've pointed out, its real-time route planning and supercharger network kind of masks the worst of its offence. Because really what people want more than range is ease of use and reliable, dependable long-distance road tripping. And frankly, whatever you think of Elon Musk these days and/or Tesla's practices, I think we all have to agree Tesla nailed the whole infrastructure thing. And in the meantime, we should be looking at the range tests carried out by the lovely Tom Moloughney from State of Charge and Inside EVs, and Kyle from Out of Spec, both of whom do incredible real-world range tests for pretty much every EV on sale today. And no, we are not going to bother doing them on this channel because theirs are awesome, and frankly, I don't think we can do them any better. Finally though, I don't think this problem is going to be solved overnight. The auto industry has been trying to accurately portray range and gas mileage for decades, and we're still no closer to a magic solution. Unless, of course, you happen to have a spare quantum computer tucked behind your couch. And on that note, we are done with today's video. If you have comments, drop us a polite note below. Emphasis on polite. You can reach out to us in the Discord chat room, you can reach out to us on Mastodon, or if you are a Patreon supporter, in the comments section there. If you're watching this on PeerTube, you can reply there and it will appear on the Mastodons. It's very cool. If you want more, subscribe, hit the bell and follow the links below to regularly support us with a YouTube membership or a Patreon subscription. You'll also find links to our Ko-fi, Bitcoin and Swagster, as well as that aforementioned Mastodon server. Scrolling on my right is the list of amazing charged up supporters, and shout outs go out to our V2G Patreon supporters: Alan Tupper, Andrew Martin, Bennett Elder, Brophy Wolf, Chris Maxwell, Cyprian Laplace, Dan Blair, Gordon C, Hey Esker, John Tramal, Kyle Fox, Mark Eggleton, Peter Dillinger, Regine Fellows, Sean Tucker, Stefan Framgen, Stephen Williams, Tesla in the Gong, Paul Bricknell, Tony Moss, Carl Hodgson, Chris Centaur, Denny Hyde, Lance Schlal, Linda Irish, Mike Weeder and Paul Nelson. And finally, big thanks to our off-grid supporters: Paul Conway, Kevin Burrowbridge, Stephen O'Donoghue, Jim Burness, Robert Flannery, Aaron Hahn, Ellery Hansley, Rory Litwin, JP Fagerback, Dave Kitchen, Andrew Glenn, Anonymous Freak, Chris and Michael Johnson, CPU Freak 101, Eric Neck, Joe Bresney, John Henderson, Laura Reynolds, Marcel Ward, Matthew Drobnak, Nigel S, Reggie Watts, Will Graylin, and of course, Ian. Don't forget that we make videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday and Saturday on this channel. Plus, on a Sunday, you'll find us over on Take 2. And with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Stick around for the Classic Mix segment in a second if you want to see it. I'll see you soon, and as always, keep evolving. I think I said the Classic Mix segment just then, but of course I meant the Classic Mac segment. And I've been thinking a lot lately about one of the favourite games that I had when I was in sixth form. I told you about that a couple of shows ago. There was a skiing game that you could play on classic macOS that didn't use a mouse, but you could use a mouse. And it was like an Olympic skiing game. And I used to play it on an old Mac Classic in the music office before the day got underway, and I used to play it while I was waiting for the coffee machine to brew. As I previously said, I had a key to the music department. I'm sure that wouldn't be allowed now. And I used to go in early because I used to ride my bike to school, and I used to go into the department and put the coffee on for the head of department. And then I'd go and turn on this classic Mac and play this skiing game. And I cannot for the life of me remember what it was. So if you can remember it, let me know, because I would love to play it again.